Instantly seizing central territory, 1e4 immediately challenges the board's core and opens diagonals for queen and bishop development, setting an aggressive tone. Embracing the Sicilian, black immediately contests central space and challenges white's pawn. Instantly contesting the center, this knight leap immediately prepares d4 and puts pressure on black's pawn structure. Solidifying central presence and preparing for kingside development, this pawn advance opens diagonals and asserts control. Challenging the center immediately, this move creates central tension and opens lines for white's pieces. Opening the center aggressively, black concedes a central pawn presence but aims for rapid piece development and a more dynamic pawn structure in return. Unleashing a knight to the center immediately challenges black's central presence, aiming to control key squares and prepare for further piece development. Developing a knight to a more active central square, this knight now eyes white's d4 pawn and prepares for further development, setting a classic Sicilian challenge. Unleashing knights to centralize and prepare rapid development, this establishes a firm grip on key squares. Preparing to challenge central space, this maneuver creates a subtle queenside pawn structure to support future advances and potentially restrict white's bishop. Developing the bishop to the active c4 square now directly eyes the f7 weakness, a classic attacking theme that can put immediate pressure on black's kingside and potentially lead to early tactical opportunities or forced defensive maneuvers. Stepping back, preparing a pawn shield and opening a diagonal for the bishop, this establishes a more solid defensive structure, though it temporarily blocks the queen's bishop, potentially limiting its immediate influence in the center and on the kingside. Safeguarding the bishop from the immediate pawn advance on b5 while preparing for future pawn breaks, this retreat maintains attacking potential on the kingside. Preparing for castling, black gently secures their king's flank and develops a key piece, aiming for a balanced position where their queenside majority can eventually be activated. Pushing the f-pawn here opens lines, aiming to seize the initiative by creating immediate pressure on black's kingside and potentially challenging the d6 pawn's support. It's a double-edged sword, however, as it also weakens white's own king's safety by exposing the e1h4 diagonal. This aggressive pawn thrust signifies a desire for active play and a willingness to embrace complications, potentially leading to sharp tactical exchanges if black isn't prepared to defend carefully. Developing the knight to d7 solidifies the pawn on e6, prepares for potential queenside expansion with b5, and keeps the bishop on g7 open for the kingside fianchetto or a direct kingside attack. The queen repositions, casting a watchful eye over the d5 square, a crucial central outpost, and simultaneously prepares to swing towards the kingside if the opportunity arises. Shifting the pawn to the edge often signals a desire to expand on the flank, perhaps to establish a foothold or to disrupt white's developing pieces. However, this commitment forward could create weaknesses around your king, so be mindful of how white might exploit the newly opened diagonals or files. Consider how this pawn advance influences the central control and the future pawn breaks you might aim for. Developing the bishop to its most active square, pinning the potential knight advance, aims to prepare for kingside castling while building pressure on the d-pawn. Securing the queen's diagonal and preparing to challenge the center, this development harmonizes with black's strategy of building a solid, yet flexible, structure against white's aggressive pawn storm. It also subtly signals readiness to engage on the queen side. Embarking on a daring sidestep into the complexities of the Najdorf, white now casts the king to safety on the queen side, a classic response to black's ambitious pawn advances and potential kingside pressure. This maneuver immediately introduces the concept of opposite-side castling, a battleground where quick pawn storms and direct attacks often decide the victor. White's intent is clear: to leverage the open files on the queen side, particularly the c-file, and to prepare an aggressive pawn eruption with moves like b4 and c4. It's a choice that sacrifices immediate pawn structure integrity on the king side for a more dynamic, albeit riskier, attacking initiative. The knight's relocation to c5 injects immediate dynamism into the queen side, challenging the white bishop on b3 and preparing to exploit potential weaknesses should the bishop retreat or be forced to exchange. This maneuver simultaneously supports a potential pawn push to b5, aiming to expand black's space and potentially disrupt white's harmonious piece development. It's a proactive move, shifting from passive defense to active counterplay. Unleashing a bold pawn thrust, white aims to rip open lines on the kingside, seeking to exploit black's potentially exposed monarch and create attacking avenues towards g7. A bold assertion of space and intent. Black decisively pushes the e-pawn, challenging white's central control and immediately complicating the pawn structure. This pawn thrust, while potentially creating a passed pawn later, also opens lines for white's pieces and might expose the kingside if not supported properly. It's a move that injects immediate dynamism, forcing white to reevaluate their attacking plans and consider how to exploit the new imbalances, especially on the queen side. Suddenly, the knight repositions, creating a less obvious but potentially dynamic presence on e2, allowing the king's pawn to advance further and bolstering the central pawn structure while preparing for a potential kingside pawn storm or a surprise knight maneuver to the queenside. Disrupting the knights creates a dynamic shift, forcing white's bishop to retreat and potentially weakening the light squares around the king. Opening the a-file after that exchange immediately grants white a powerful attacking avenue towards black's queenside, potentially creating dynamic play and forcing a response that might weaken black's pawn structure further. Unleashing an assault on the queenside, black aims to disrupt white's kingside castling advantage and create immediate counterplay. The bishop now pierces down the long diagonal, aiming to disrupt black's pawn structure and potentially create weaknesses around the castled king. Black seeks to develop their bishop to a square where it eyes the queenside and supports potential pawn advances. This maneuver aims to prepare for a queenside expansion, possibly b4, to challenge white's central control and potentially open lines for black's pieces. The bishop on b7 also offers defensive support for the c5 square, which might become a target if white's knight repositions. It's a subtle but important step in black's queenside development, setting up future strategic possibilities. Unlocking the d-file's potential, this capture strategically eliminates black's well-placed knight, a key defender of its monarch, while simultaneously opening lines for white's attacking pieces. The resulting pawn structure shift creates immediate pressure along the newly freed file, offering white improved attacking avenues and a more dynamic position. The bishop has found a new, active diagonal, eyeing the kingside and potentially disrupting white's castled position, even though it means sacrificing pawn structure integrity to achieve this piece redistribution. Suddenly, the center opens up, and white's knight, previously hemmed in, now eyes the f6 square with menacing intent, preparing to exploit the weakened diagonal pointing towards black's monarch. Exchanging the bishop for the knight on d5, a pivotal outpost, fundamentally alters the pawn structure, creating a slightly isolated e-pawn for white on the kingside and potentially opening the file for black's rook if they choose to activate it. This liquidation, while simplifying the immediate pressure, may also cede some initiative. Opening the d-file presents a double-edged sword. While it grants access for your rook, it also exposes it if black can achieve the necessary piece repositioning to exploit the open highway. A bold pawn thrust has just been parried, and black now shifts focus to securing the open files and establishing a more robust pawn structure, recognizing that white's queen and rook are poised for aggressive action on the queen side. Securing the queen side is paramount. This repositioning centralizes the queen, aiming to support a potential expansion on that flank while eyeing any weaknesses black might have created. Shifting the monarch to e7 signals a cautious retreat, aiming to consolidate the king's position amidst white's mounting queenside pressure. This cautious maneuver acknowledges the exposed nature of the king on the open file and seeks refuge behind the pawns. Black prioritizes safety, recognizing that an immediate attack on the central pawns might be premature given white's solid structure and active pieces. By centralizing the king, black prepares for potential pawn advances and attempts to connect the rooks more effectively, creating a more cohesive defensive setup. Securing the king on the queen side allows for greater flexibility in maneuvering pieces, especially given the pawn structure's openness along the c-file. And importantly, it prepares for potential pawn advances on the queenside later on. Seeking to pry open the kingside further, this pawn thrust aims to disrupt white's carefully constructed defensive web and create potential weaknesses around the enemy monarch. Stepping back the rook from its active post on the d-file to d1 might seem counterintuitive, but it's a shrewd repositioning aimed at reinforcing potential pawn breaks later and preparing for a dynamic rook lift. White anticipates black's likely moves and seeks to maintain flexibility, possibly to swing the rook over to the kingside if the opportunity arises or to support a future c-pawn advance. This move, therefore, is not about immediate aggression, but about subtle positional restructuring, anticipating the evolving nature of the battlefield and ensuring the king's safety from any sudden tactical thrusts. The rook's relocation to the d-file solidifies black's presence on an open file, aiming to contest white's dominant rook and potentially pressure the king's defenses. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure with c3 intends to shore up white's pawn chain and prevent black's knight from potentially hopping to b4. It's a prophylactic maneuver aiming to control critical squares and lend structural integrity, though it does cede a degree of pawn flexibility and slightly closes off the diagonal for the light-squared bishop. A proactive repositioning of the queen to a square where it can simultaneously eye white's doubled pawns on the queenside and potentially support a pawn push down the b-file, all while seeking better defensive harmony. An ambitious pawn thrust, challenging the queenside expansion and aiming to create space for white's pieces. Black's king feels increasingly exposed on the queenside, so anchoring the rook to the c-file here aims to offer some defensive support, potentially preparing for a regrouping of pieces while simultaneously contesting this important open file. Gaining a foothold on the kingside requires immense patience, and this repositioning of the knight toward the kingside, potentially to f3 or g3, aims to shore up that vulnerable flank and prepare for a slow, methodical advance, a stark contrast to the earlier pawn storm. Black consolidates the bishop's position, bringing it to a more active diagonal where it eyes white's queenside pawn structure, while simultaneously creating potential harassment of white's king if the center opens further. Nodding the knight to f3 aims to bolster the kingside defense, preventing any immediate pawn pushes from black's queenside initiative, while also freeing up the g2 square for potential king safety adjustments if needed later. Solidifying the kingside pawn structure with f6 addresses the immediate pressure black faced from white's knights potentially penetrating on e5 or g5, while also reinforcing the e5 square. This defensive measure, however, comes at a positional cost, creating a slight weakness on g6 that white might exploit later, especially if the e-pawn were to advance. It also blocks the bishop's natural diagonal after it was forced to retreat. While preventing immediate tactical threats, this move commits black to a more passive pawn structure on the kingside. The focus now shifts to improving piece coordination and finding active play on the queenside or center to counter white's potential pawn breaks. Black needs to be mindful of the slightly compromised king's safety this move inadvertently creates. Opening the kingside for potential breakthroughs, this pawn thrust signals a willingness to disrupt black's pawn structure and perhaps create new attacking avenues, even if it momentarily weakens white's own king's safety. Opening the kingside thoroughfare presents both immediate danger and potential counterplay as the pawn chain collapses, demanding precise calculation of discovered attacks and king safety. Initiating a calculated pawn sacrifice to pry open the kingside, this move immediately disrupts black's defensive structure, creating avenues for white's rooks and queen to exploit. The pawn advance across the kingside has finally broken open the file, creating an immediate tactical imbalance. Unleashing the queen here creates immediate threats on the kingside, particularly targeting the weakened pawn structure around black's monarch. White aims to exploit the open lines that have materialized, potentially forcing concessions or even initiating a mating attack. This aggressive posture disrupts black's defensive setup and demands a precise response to avoid further positional deterioration. Reigning in the king's wanderlust is paramount. After all this pawn structure reshaping and piece maneuvering, the monarch is exposed to potential discoveries and disruptions, making a more secure position the immediate priority. Seizing the opportunity, white snatches a pawn, opening lines and aiming to destabilize black's already compromised king position. This aggressive pawn grab introduces immediate tactical complexities, potentially unraveling black's defenses if not handled with extreme care. The sacrifice of material, while seemingly bold, forces black into a defensive posture, where every move will be scrutinized for potential weaknesses. White's initiative is palpable, and this capture dramatically alters the game's complexion, pushing it towards a sharp, decisive conclusion where black's king's safety will be paramount. The black king, having ventured aggressively into the center, now finds itself exposed on the c7 square, a potential target for white's heavy pieces and the exposed d-file. Exploiting the king's precarious sidewalk, white unleashes a bold sacrifice that dramatically alters the complexion of the board by drawing the black monarch into a dangerous, exposed position. A fascinating decision. Black embraces a precarious position, prioritizing opening the g-file rather than consolidating their king's defense against the immediate queen threat. This gambit sacrifices material for potential counterplay down the open file, but it leaves the king quite exposed, a risky proposition indeed given the opponent's rampant queen. The rook on the 7th rank now exerts tremendous pressure, and the white queen's sacrifice of the pawn opens a direct assault on black's compromised kingside, forcing a defensive scramble.